The first light of dawn had barely touched the ridgeline when the sound cut through the Montana cold like a blade. It was not quite a cry, not quite a wail, but something raw and desperate that belonged to no living thing that should still be breathing. The locals who heard it from their farmhouses pulled their curtains tighter and turned up their radios. Whatever was dying out there in the frozen ravine was not their problem, not their land, not their burden. But Rebecca Thornton heard it differently. She had been awake for hours already, staring at the cracked ceiling of her rental cabin, watching shadows chase each other across the plaster. Sleep had become a stranger to her in the months since the funeral. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound reached her through the thin walls and settled into her chest like a stone. She knew that sound. She had heard it before in examination rooms and late-night emergencies back when she still worked at the veterinary clinic, back when she still believed that saving things mattered. The trembling cry came again, weaker this time, and something inside her that had been frozen for 8 long months cracked just enough to let the light in. She pulled on her boots without thinking, grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter, and stepped out into the bitter cold of early November. The air bit at her lungs as she made her way down the gravel path toward the old copper mining property that bordered the town. Most people avoided the place. The ground was unstable, the fences rusted and collapsed, and the previous owner had let it fall into ruin before dying without heirs. Now it sat like a scar on the edge of Redstone Valley, a place where unwanted things went to disappear. Rebecca climbed over the sagging barbed wire and followed the sound down into the ravine. The earth was slick with frost, and twice she nearly lost her footing on the steep descent. When she finally reached the bottom, her flashlight beam found what she had been dreading to see. A foal lay crumpled against the rocks, its body so thin that every rib stood out like prison bars. The chestnut coat was matted with mud and something darker, and one of its back legs was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin split and weeping. The foal's eyes were half closed, glazed with fever, and its breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps. Rebecca dropped to her knees beside it, her hands moving on instinct even as her mind screamed at her to walk away. This was not her responsibility. She had nothing left to give. She had buried her husband in February, lost her job in April when the grief made her hands shake too badly to assist in surgery, and spent the summer watching her savings drain away while the town whispered about the widow who could not pull herself together. She had come to Redstone Valley to escape the pity in her old town, to disappear into a place where no one knew her story. The last thing she needed was to anchor herself to something dying. But her fingers were already checking the foal's pulse, feeling the rapid flutter beneath the skin. Her other hand pressed gently against the distended belly, noting the dehydration, the muscle wasting, the infected wound that had probably been festering for days. This foal had been abandoned, left to die alone in the cold. And somehow, in the flickering beam of her flashlight, Rebecca saw herself reflected in those dull, pain-filled eyes. The sky was turning pale gray by the time Rebecca made it back to her cabin, her arms trembling from the effort of half-carrying, half-dragging the foal up the slope. She had fashioned a makeshift sling from her jacket, supporting the foal's weight while it stumbled and collapsed repeatedly on the climb. By the time they reached level ground, both of them were gasping for air, their breath making white clouds in the freezing dawn. Rebecca's hands were numb, her back screaming in protest, but she did not stop until she had the foal inside the small detached garage that had come with the rental. The space was barely bigger than a horse stall, filled with rusted tools and cardboard boxes left by previous tenants. Rebecca swept everything aside with her forearm, her mind clicking through the supplies she would need. Old blankets, water, antibiotics if she could get them. She knew what this would cost, knew that every dollar she spent on this dying animal was a dollar she did not have. Her landlord was already asking questions about next month's rent. Her sister-in-law Jolene had been calling every week, her voice dripping with concern that sounded more like judgment, suggesting that maybe it was time for Rebecca to come stay with family, to stop this foolish independence, to admit she could not make it on her own. But as Rebecca wrapped the foal in every blanket she owned and watched those labored breaths begin to slow into something almost like rest, She felt the first stirring of purpose she had known in months. The foal's body heat was dangerously low, its legs twitching with what Rebecca recognized as neurological symptoms from prolonged fever. The infected wound needed immediate attention, but she had no medical supplies, no authorization to purchase prescription medications, and no money to pay a veterinarian for a house call. She was alone with a dying animal and a choice she had not planned to make. The town of Redstone Valley was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and Rebecca had worked hard to stay invisible since arriving 3 months ago. She bought her groceries at odd hours, avoided eye contact at the post office, and never lingered anywhere long enough for conversation to take root. But now she needed help, and help meant exposure. It meant walking into the feed store on Main Street where the ranchers gathered every morning to drink burnt coffee and trade gossip. It meant asking for credit she probably would not get and answering questions she did not want to face. She left the foal sleeping fitfully in the garage, a bucket of lukewarm water within reach though she doubted the animal had the strength to drink. The sun was fully up now, and the streets of Redstone Valley were coming to life with the slow rhythm of a rural town. Pickup trucks lined Main Street, their beds filled with hay bales and feed sacks. Men in work jackets stood in clusters, their voices carrying through the cold air. Rebecca pulled her hood up and kept her head down as she pushed through the door of Patterson's Feed and Supply. The bell above the door announced her entrance, and the conversations died like someone had thrown a switch. Rebecca felt every eye in the store turn toward her, felt the weight of their curiosity and speculation. She had forgotten how it felt to be seen, and the sensation made her want to bolt back out into the street. But she forced herself to walk to the counter where Old Man Patterson stood with his arms crossed, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp with interest. Rebecca cleared her throat, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. She needed basic medical supplies, antiseptic, bandages, electrolyte solution if he had it. Patterson raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking past her to the men gathered by the coffee pot. One of them, a thick-shouldered rancher named Graham Hutchins, stepped forward with the confidence of someone who owned half the county. Rebecca recognized him from the property deeds she had seen posted at the county office. He was the one who had inherited the old copper mining land where she had found the foal. Graham's voice carried across the store, pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. He asked if she had been trespassing on his property. There was no accusation in his tone yet, just a kind of flat curiosity that made Rebecca's stomach tighten. She met his eyes and told him she had heard something in distress at dawn. An animal. She had gone to investigate. Graham nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He said he had heard something too, a few days back. Mare had probably dropped a foal and abandoned it. Happened sometimes when the stock was feral. Nature's way of culling the weak. He said it with the casualness of someone stating a weather forecast. Rebecca felt her hands curl into fists at her sides. She asked if he had checked on it. Graham shrugged, said he had better things to do than chase. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After every coyote or stray that wandered onto his land. Besides, the mining property was dangerous, unstable ground, and he did not want the liability of someone getting hurt out there. He had been meaning to post more no trespassing signs. His eyes stayed on Rebecca as he spoke, and she understood the warning underneath his words. Whatever she had found out, there was not his problem, and he expected it to stay that way. Patterson broke the tension by asking what supplies she needed exactly. Rebecca listed them, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. Patterson wrote it down on a pad, his pencil scratching loud in the quiet store. When he finished, he named a price that made Rebecca's breath catch. She did not have that much. Not without dipping into the emergency fund she had set aside for rent. Patterson's expression did not change, but his voice softened just slightly. He could put it on account if she planned to pay by the end of the month. It was not a kindness exactly, more a business calculation, but Rebecca nodded and thanked him. As she waited for Patterson to gather the supplies, she felt the weight of judgment settling over the store like fog. These men knew the economics of livestock. They knew that saving a sick foal with no bloodline and no owner was a fool's errand. They saw a widow woman barely keeping herself afloat, throwing away money on something that would probably die anyway. One of the younger ranch hands muttered something about city folk not understanding how things worked out here. Another laughed, low and mean. Graham Hutchins said nothing, but his eyes followed Rebecca as she took her bag of supplies and walked back out into the cold morning. The walk back to her cabin felt longer than it should have. Rebecca's arms ached from carrying the supplies, and her mind raced with doubt. What was she doing? She could not afford this. Could not afford the medicine, the time, the emotional investment in something that statistics said would not survive. She had watched enough animals die in her years as a veterinary technician to know the odds. A foal this sick, this young, abandoned and untreated for days, the chances were almost non-existent. The smart thing would be to call Dr. Voss at the veterinary clinic and ask her to come put the animal down humanely. It would be the merciful choice, the practical choice. But when Rebecca opened the garage door and saw the foal still breathing, still fighting despite everything, she could not make that call. Instead, she knelt in the dirt beside the small body and began the work of trying to save a life she had no business saving. She cleaned the infected wound with antiseptic, her hands remembering the motions even as tears blurred her vision. The foal barely responded to her touch, too weak to even flinch at the pain. Rebecca wrapped the leg in clean bandages and coaxed electrolyte solution into the foal's mouth drop by drop, most of it spilling onto the blankets. Hours passed in that dim garage, the only sounds the foal's labored breathing and the wind rattling the loose boards. Rebecca talked as she worked, her voice filling the silence with words she had not spoken aloud in months. She told the foal about her husband Michael, about the way he used to make her coffee every morning and leave it on the bathroom counter so it would be there when she got out of the shower. She told the foal about the accident, the phone call that had shattered her world, the funeral where she had stood dry-eyed and numb while everyone watched and whispered. She told the foal about the crushing weight of grief that made every breath feel like drowning, about the way she had stopped answering calls and started driving until she ran out of road. The foal's ear twitched at the sound of her voice, a small movement but the first sign of awareness Rebecca had seen. She leaned closer, her hand resting gently on the foal's neck, feeling the too rapid heartbeat beneath the skin. She whispered that she understood what it felt like to be abandoned, to be left behind by something that should have stayed. She told the foal that maybe they were both too stubborn to know when to quit. And in that moment, kneeling in the dirt beside a dying animal, Rebecca Thornton made a choice that would change everything. She was not going to let this foal die alone. The foal survived the first night, though calling it survival felt generous. Rebecca woke every 2 hours to check the breathing, to press her palm against the small chest and count the heartbeats that came too fast and too weak. Each time she entered the garage, she expected to find the body still and cold, but each time those eyes would flutter open for just a moment before closing again. By the second morning, Rebecca had not slept more than 30 minutes at a stretch, and her hands shook as she prepared another bottle of electrolyte solution. The infection in the leg had not improved despite the antibiotics she had managed to administer. The swelling had spread higher, and the foal's temperature remained dangerously elevated. Rebecca knew she needed proper veterinary care, the kind that required equipment and expertise she did not possess. But calling Dr. Voss meant inviting scrutiny, meant explaining why she had taken on this impossible task, meant opening herself up to the questions she had been avoiding since arriving in Redstone Valley. It meant being seen. Rebecca sat on an overturned crate in the garage, watching the foal's sides rise and fall with effort. The November wind howled outside, rattling the thin walls, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The cold was getting worse, and the garage had no heat beyond the pile of blankets she had wrapped around the foal. She had read once that foals could not regulate their body temperature well, that they needed their mothers for warmth in the first weeks of life. This one had neither mother nor proper shelter, just a grieving woman who barely knew how to take care of herself anymore. The sound of an engine approaching pulled Rebecca from her thoughts. She stood quickly, her heart racing with an anxiety that had become her constant companion. Through the grimy window, she watched a battered pickup truck pull into her driveway. A teenage boy climbed out, tall and lanky with sun-bleached hair sticking out from under a baseball cap. Rebecca recognized him vaguely from town, one of the kids who worked the ranches during the summer and after school. He stood in her driveway for a moment, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, looking uncertain. Rebecca stepped out of the garage, pulling the door closed behind her. The boy jumped slightly, then straightened his shoulders like he was trying to look older than he was. He introduced himself as Danny Whitmore, said he worked for Graham Hutchins sometimes, doing odd jobs around the mining property. He had heard in town that she had found something out there, and he wanted to see if it was true. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying not to sound too interested, but Rebecca caught the flicker of curiosity in his eyes. She asked him what he had heard exactly. Danny shrugged, scuffing his boot against the gravel. People were talking at the feed store, saying she had dragged some half-dead foal off Hutchins' land. His dad had told him to stay away from there, said whatever she was doing was her own business and none of theirs. But Danny had been the one who heard the mare screaming a week ago, out past the old mine shaft. He had told Hutchins about it, but the man had just waved him off, said feral horses were not worth chasing down. Danny's jaw tightened when he said it, and Rebecca understood that the boy had wanted to check on the animal but had not been allowed. Rebecca studied him for a long moment, weighing the risk of letting someone else see what she had taken on. If word spread that the foal was in worse shape than people thought, the judgment would intensify. Graham Hutchins might even use it as an excuse to reclaim the animal, to put it down on his property and be done with the liability. But there was something in Danny's expression that reminded Rebecca of herself at that age, back when she still believed that caring about things was worth the trouble it caused. She opened the garage door wider and gestured for him to follow. Danny stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. When he saw the foal lying motionless except for the shallow breathing, his expression crumpled into something between pity and anger. He knelt down without asking permission, his hand hovering over the foal's neck before touching it gently. The foal's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and glassy with fever. Danny swore under his breath, the kind of curse that came from seeing something he had feared was true. He asked how long she had been fighting the infection. Rebecca told him 3 days now, that she had been doing everything she could with the supplies she had, but it was not enough. The foal needed 4 fluids, stronger antibiotics, possibly surgery to clean out the wound properly. Danny looked up at her, his young face suddenly older. He asked if she had called Dr. Voss. Rebecca shook her head, said she could not afford the house call fee, let alone the treatment costs. Danny sat back on his heels, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he was not sure he should say. Finally, he told her that Dr. Voss had a soft spot for lost causes. 2 years ago, Danny's own horse had gotten tangled in barbed wire and nearly bled out. His family could not afford the emergency surgery, but Dr. Voss had done it anyway, let them pay her back in labor over the summer. She never advertised that kind of thing, but people knew. If Rebecca explained the situation, Dr. Voss might help. Danny's voice carried a desperate kind of hope, the same hope Rebecca had been trying not to feel. But there was a catch, and Danny knew it as well as Rebecca did. Dr. Voss would ask questions. She would want to know why Rebecca had taken this on, why she thought she could save a foal this far gone, whether she understood what she was committing to. And those questions would lead to other questions, the kind that would strip away the protective anonymity Rebecca had built around herself. The kind that would force her to admit she had nothing left to lose, which was both why she had taken the foal and why she had no business doing so. Rebecca told Danny she would think about it. The boy nodded, but his eyes stayed on the foal, and Rebecca could see him doing the same calculations she had been doing. How many more days could the animal survive without proper care? How long before the infection turned septic and the choice was taken away entirely? Danny stood slowly, brushing dirt from his jeans. He said if she decided to call Dr. Voss, he would come back and help however he could. He worked after school and on weekends, knew his way around horses. His offer hung in the air between them, genuine and unexpected. After Danny left, Rebecca sat in the garage for a long time, listening to the foal's labored breathing and the wind screaming around the building. The rational part of her brain, the part that had been screaming at her since she dragged this animal up from the ravine, told her to call Dr. Voss now, to get help before it was too late. But another part of her, the part that had been silent since Michael's death, whispered that asking for help meant admitting she needed it. And admitting need meant vulnerability, meant giving people permission to see how broken she really was. The foal stirred, a small movement that sent a spike of hope through Rebecca's chest. She moved closer, checking the pulse, feeling the temperature of the skin. Still too hot, still too weak, but alive, still fighting. Rebecca made her decision with the same impulsive certainty that had made her climb into that ravine 3 days ago. She would call Dr. Voss. She would accept whatever judgment came with it, because this foal deserved more than Rebecca's inadequate care and stubborn pride. The Redstone Valley Veterinary Clinic sat on the edge of town in a converted ranch house, its white siding weathered gray and the porch sagging slightly under the weight of too many Montana winters. Rebecca stood in the parking lot for 5 full minutes before she could make herself walk to the door. Her phone call that morning had been brief and professional. She had explained the situation in clinical terms: foal approximately 3 weeks old, severe malnutrition, infected wound on left hind leg, signs of neurological distress. Dr. Voss had listened without interrupting, then said she would come by that afternoon to assess the animal. Now, standing in the clinic parking lot waiting for Dr. Voss to finish with another patient, Rebecca felt the full weight of what she had set in motion. A woman emerged from the clinic holding a cat carrier, nodding to Rebecca as she passed. The bell above the door chimed, and Dr. Patricia Voss appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. She was in her late 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of working outdoors. Her eyes were sharp and assessing as they landed on Rebecca. Dr. Voss introduced herself, though they had met briefly once before when Rebecca first arrived in town. The veterinarian gestured toward her truck, a heavy-duty vehicle with a covered bed full of medical equipment. She asked for the address and Rebecca gave it, then climbed into her own car to lead the way. The drive back to her cabin felt too short, the miles disappearing too quickly. Rebecca's hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to hurt, and she forced herself to breathe slowly, to calm the panic rising in her chest. When they arrived, Danny was already there, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed. Rebecca had not asked him to come, but she felt a rush of gratitude at the sight of him. Dr. Voss raised an eyebrow at the boy but said nothing, just grabbed her medical bag from the truck bed and followed Rebecca to the garage. The space felt smaller with 3 people in it, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and sickness. Dr. Voss knelt beside the foal without preamble, her hands moving with the efficient confidence of someone who had examined thousands of animals. The silence stretched as Dr. Voss worked, her fingers probing the swollen leg, checking the foal's eyes and gums, listening to the heart and lungs with a stethoscope. Rebecca stood frozen, barely breathing, waiting for the verdict she already knew was coming. When Dr. Voss finally sat back on her heels, her expression was unreadable. She asked Rebecca where she had found the foal. Rebecca explained about the ravine, about hearing the cries at dawn, about Graham Hutchins' property and his dismissal of the situation. Dr. Voss nodded slowly, her jaw tightening in a way that suggested she had opinions about Graham Hutchins that she was keeping to herself. She told Rebecca the foal was in critical condition, that the infection had likely been festering for 5 days or more before Rebecca found her. The neurological symptoms were concerning, possibly indicating that the fever had caused some brain damage, though it was too early to tell how severe. The malnutrition alone would take weeks to address, and that was assuming the foal survived the next few days. Rebecca's throat tightened. She asked what the chances were. Dr. Voss looked at her for a long moment, and Rebecca saw the calculation happening behind those sharp eyes. The veterinarian was weighing not just the foal's chances of survival, but Rebecca's ability to handle the truth. Finally, Dr. Voss said that honestly, most veterinarians would recommend euthanasia. The foal's quality of life, even if she survived, was uncertain. The cost of treatment would be significant, and there was no guarantee of success. It would be the humane choice to let her go peacefully. The words landed like stones in Rebecca's chest, heavy and cold. She had known this was possible, had prepared herself for it, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that hollowed her out. She looked down at the foal, at the small body wrapped in blankets, at the chest that still rose and fell with stubborn determination. Danny shifted beside her, and she heard him swallow hard. Dr. Voss continued, her voice gentler now. But if Rebecca was willing to do the work, if she understood what she was committing to, Dr. Voss would help her try. Rebecca's head snapped up, hope flaring so suddenly it hurt. Dr. Voss held up a hand, tempering the reaction. She needed to be clear about what trying meant. The foal would need round-the-clock care for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. For fluids multiple times a day, oral medications every few hours, wound care that would be painful for the animal and difficult for Rebecca to perform alone. The foal would need to be kept warm, monitored constantly for signs of distress or decline. And even with all of that, the odds were still against them. Dr. Voss would donate her time and some of the medication, but Rebecca would need to cover the cost of supplies, and it would not be cheap. Rebecca heard herself saying yes before her brain could catch up with her mouth. Yes, she would do it. Yes, she understood the odds. Yes, she knew what she was committing to. The words tumbled out with a desperate certainty that startled even her. Dr. Voss studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once. She would start the 4 fluids now, show Rebecca how to maintain the line, and leave detailed instructions for the medication schedule. She would come back tomorrow to check on the foal's progress. But Rebecca needed to understand that if the foal declined despite treatment, if she was suffering, the kind thing would be to let her go. Rebecca nodded, not trusting her voice. Dr. Voss turned back to her bag, pulling out equipment and explaining each step as she worked. Danny moved closer, paying careful attention to the instructions, and Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude for his presence. The veterinarian inserted the forecatheter with practiced ease, taping it securely to the foal's leg and hanging the fluid bag from a nail Danny found in the wall. She showed Rebecca how to monitor the drip rate, how to check that the catheter was still in place, what signs to watch for that would indicate complications. As Dr. Voss worked, she asked questions that seemed casual but were not. How long had Rebecca been in Redstone Valley? What had brought her here? Did she have experience with livestock? Rebecca answered carefully, revealing as little as possible while still being honest. She had worked as a veterinary technician for several years. She had moved here recently for a fresh start. She lived alone. Dr. Voss accepted the non-answers without pushing, but Rebecca caught the flicker of understanding in the older woman's eyes. She knew Rebecca was running from something, even if she did not know what. When Dr. Voss finished, she stood and brushed off her knees. She told Danny to help Rebecca set up a better heating system in the garage, that the foal could not maintain her body temperature with just blankets. Danny nodded eagerly, already mentally cataloging what he could bring from his family's barn. Dr. Voss turned back to Rebecca, her expression serious. She said that what Rebecca was doing was either very brave or very foolish, possibly both. But she respected the commitment. If Rebecca needed anything, day or night, she should call. The veterinarian did not shake hands, just nodded once and walked back to her truck. After Dr. Voss left, Rebecca and Danny stood in the garage, listening to the steady drip of the 4 fluids. The foal's breathing seemed easier already, though Rebecca knew that might be wishful thinking. Danny broke the silence by asking what she was going to call the foal. Rebecca realized she had not even thought about a name, had been too focused on keeping the animal alive to consider anything beyond survival. She looked at the chestnut coat, at the way the thin shaft of sunlight coming through the window caught the reddish tones in the fur. The foal's white blaze ran down her face like a lightning strike. Rebecca heard herself say Ember, and the name felt right in a way she could not explain, like something small and fragile that could still hold fire. Danny repeated it, testing the sound, then nodded his approval. He said he would go home and get a space heater his mom was not using anymore, maybe some extra straw for bedding. He would be back before dark. Rebecca thanked him, her voice thick with emotion she was trying to keep contained. Danny shrugged like it was nothing, but his eyes lingered on Ember for a moment before he left. Alone again, Rebecca sank down beside Ember, her hand resting lightly on the foal's neck. The skin was still too hot, but the 4 fluids were going in, and that was something. That was progress. Rebecca felt the exhaustion of the past 3 days crash over her like a wave, but she could not rest yet. She had medications to administer in 2 hours, and she needed to monitor the 4 constantly. She needed to stay awake, to stay vigilant, to prove that her yes had meant something. As the afternoon light faded into evening, Rebecca found herself talking to Ember the way she had been doing since the first night. She told the foal about Michael, about the way he used to sing off-key in the shower and burn toast every Sunday morning. She told Ember about the moment the police officer had appeared at her door, about the way time had seemed to stop and then speed up all at once. She told Ember about the funeral where she had stood surrounded by people and felt completely alone, about the months afterward when she had moved through her life like a ghost haunting her own existence. And she told Ember something she had not admitted to anyone, not even to herself in the darkest hours of night, that she had not wanted to keep living, that she had driven to Redstone Valley because it was far away from everything she had known, and she had thought maybe she could just fade out here, disappear into the landscape like snow melting in spring, that she had stopped answering her phone because she could not bear the weight of other people's concern, that she had been waiting, in some wordless way, for permission to give up. Rebecca's voice broke on the last words, and she pressed her face against her knees, shoulders shaking with sobs she had been holding back for months. Ember stirred slightly, a small movement that brought Rebecca's head up. The foal's eyes were open, clearer than they had been since Rebecca found her. For a moment, they looked at each other, 2 broken things clinging to existence, and Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest. A cracking, like ice breaking up on a frozen river. She reached out and stroked Ember's face, her touch gentle, and whispered a promise into the growing darkness. They would survive this together or they would not survive at all. But neither of them would be alone. The first week with Ember passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small victories that felt monumental. Rebecca learned to function on 2-hour intervals, her internal clock rewiring itself around the medication schedule Dr. Voss had left. She would wake in the dark hours before dawn, stumble to the garage with her flashlight, and check the 4 line before administering another round of antibiotics. Ember's fever began to drop on the 4th day, a change so gradual Rebecca almost did not trust it until Dr. Voss confirmed it during her daily visit. The town noticed. In a place as small as Redstone Valley, a woman taking in a dying foal was the kind of story that traveled fast, gaining embellishments with each retelling. At the post office, Rebecca overheard 2 women discussing whether she was a horse whisperer or just desperate for something to care about now that her husband was gone. She had not realized people knew about Michael, but she should have guessed. Small towns had ways of uncovering information, of piecing together the outline of a person's grief from credit card records and forwarded mail. The feed store became more complicated. When Rebecca went in to buy more supplies, Patterson no longer met her eyes directly. He rang up her purchases with a kind of careful politeness that felt worse than his previous indifference. The other customers gave her a wider berth, and she caught fragments of their conversations as she waited. Someone said she was wasting money she did not have. Another voice, female and sharp, said it was sad really, a woman that broken trying to fix something just as broken. Rebecca paid cash and left quickly, her face burning with humiliation she had not expected to feel. But there were surprises too. She found a bag of grain on her porch one morning with no note, the feed expensive enough that she knew it had not been cheap. Danny showed up every afternoon after school without fail, bringing things his family could spare and asking careful questions about Ember's progress. He learned to change the 4 bags under Rebecca's supervision, his young hands steadier than hers after a week of minimal sleep. And once, when Rebecca was cleaning Ember's wound and the foal thrashed in pain, Danny held her steady and talked to her in a low, calm voice that seemed to cut through the animal's panic. Dr. Voss continued her daily visits, always arriving in the late afternoon when the light was starting to fade. She never charged for her time, though Rebecca knew the veterinarian was losing money with every hour spent in her garage. During one visit, while Rebecca was preparing more electrolyte solution, Dr. Voss asked the question Rebecca had been dreading. She wanted to know what Rebecca planned to do with Ember if she survived. Did she have property to keep a horse? Did she have experience with long-term care? Did she understand that a foal with potential neurological damage might never be sound enough to ride or work? Rebecca had no good answers. She rented the cabin month to month and had no yard to speak of, just the small garage and a strip of weedy grass. She had worked with animals but never owned one, never had to manage the daily reality of feeding and shelter and veterinary costs over years. And the truth was she had not thought beyond keeping Ember alive through each immediate crisis. The future felt like a luxury she could not afford to consider when survival was measured in hours. Dr. Voss listened to Rebecca's halting non-answers, her expression thoughtful. She said that Graham Hutchins had been asking questions around town, wanting to know if the foal was still on his property technically, if he could reclaim her and handle the situation himself. Dr. Voss had made it clear that once an animal was removed from land and placed in someone's care, ownership became complicated. But Hutchins was not a man who liked loose ends, and he did not appreciate looking negligent in front of the community. The implication was clear. If Rebecca could not prove she had a long-term plan for Ember, Hutchins might use it as an excuse to take the foal back. The thought made Rebecca's stomach clench with protective fury. She had not dragged Ember out of that ravine, had not poured her last resources into keeping her alive, just to hand her over to a man who had left her to die in the first place. But anger did not solve the practical problem. Rebecca had no land, limited money, and no legal claim to an animal found on someone else's property. She was operating on borrowed time and borrowed space, and everyone in Redstone Valley knew it. That night, after Dr. Voss left, Rebecca sat with Ember in the dim garage and tried to think through options she did not have. The foal was stronger now, able to lift her head for longer periods and take water on her own. The swelling in her leg had reduced, though the wound still needed daily cleaning and fresh bandages. Ember's eyes had lost some of their fevered glaze, and occasionally she would make small sounds that were not quite whinnies but carried a kind of questioning tone, as if she was starting to wonder about the world beyond pain and survival. Rebecca stroked Ember's neck, feeling the bones that were still too prominent under the skin. She whispered that she did not know what came next, that she was making this up as she went, that she was probably the worst person to be trusted with a life when she had barely been managing her own. But even as she said it, Rebecca felt the lie in the words. Because for the first time since Michael died, she was not just existing. She was fighting for something. The alarm on her phone would go off in another hour for the next round of medications, and instead of dreading it, she felt a strange eagerness to check on Ember's progress, to see if the foal would be strong enough to stand tomorrow. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted her thoughts. Rebecca's body tensed automatically, the anxiety that had become her default state flooding back. Through the gap in the garage door, she saw a car she did not recognize, an older sedan with rust spots along the doors. A woman got out, pulling her coat tight against the November cold. Even in the poor light, Rebecca recognized her sister-in-law Jolene, and her heart sank. Jolene had Michael's same dark hair and sharp features, but where Michael had been warm and quick to laugh, his sister carried herself with a rigid certainty that made every interaction feel like a judgment. They had never been close, even before Michael's death. Jolene had made it clear she thought Rebecca was not ambitious enough, not social enough, not enough of anything really. After the funeral, Jolene had been the one calling constantly, insisting Rebecca come stay with her family, suggesting grief counseling and antidepressants and support groups with the kind of aggressive care that felt more like surveillance. Rebecca stepped out of the garage, closing the door firmly behind her. She asked Jolene what she was doing here, how she had found her. Jolene's smile was tight and did not reach her eyes. She said Rebecca was not as invisible as she thought, that a few phone calls to former co-workers had eventually led to Redstone Valley. She had driven 6 hours to check on her brother's widow, since apparently Rebecca could not be bothered to return phone calls or let family know she was alive. The accusation stung because it was true. Rebecca had ignored every call from Jolene, had deleted voicemails without listening to them, had blocked the number eventually when the frequency became unbearable. She started to apologize, but Jolene waved it off with a gesture that said apologies were inadequate. She looked around at the shabby cabin, at the detached garage with its sagging roof, at the general air of barely managed poverty. She asked if this was really what Rebecca wanted, to hide away in the middle of nowhere, wasting away in some rental that probably had black mold in the walls. Rebecca felt her defenses rising, the old familiar pattern of Jolene pushing and Rebecca retreating. But before she could respond, a sound came from the garage. A small, questioning whinny that was stronger than any noise Ember had made before. Jolene's eyebrows rose. She asked what that was. Rebecca hesitated, knowing that letting Jolene see Ember would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny she had been avoiding. But there was no good lie, and she was too tired to construct one. She told Jolene she had taken in an abandoned foal that had been left to die. Jolene's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for Rebecca to track. Surprise, confusion, and then something that looked almost like vindication. She said she wanted to see it. Rebecca tried to say it was not a good time, that the foal was still very sick and should not be disturbed. But Jolene was already walking toward the garage. Rebecca had no choice but to follow, her heart pounding with a dread she could not fully name. When Jolene stepped inside and saw Ember lying in the nest of blankets, connected to an 4-line, her face went carefully blank. She stared for a long moment, then turned to Rebecca with an expression that was equal parts pity and anger. She asked if Rebecca understood how this looked. A woman who could barely take care of herself, who had not held down a job in months, who was behind on bills and living in a place that was one step above a shed, had somehow decided she could save a dying animal. Did Rebecca not see how unstable this appeared? How much it confirmed what Jolene had been worried about. Rebecca felt her face flush hot with shame and fury. She told Jolene that Ember was doing better, that Dr. Voss had been helping, that the foal had a real chance now. But Jolene shook her head, her voice rising. This was not about the horse. This was about Rebecca using a doomed animal as a substitute for dealing with her grief. This was about Rebecca throwing away money she did not have on something that might die anyway, just so she could have something to focus on besides her own life falling apart. Jolene's words came faster, sharper. She said that Michael would be heartbroken to see Rebecca like this, that he would want her to accept help, to come home to family instead of hiding in Montana with a project that was just another form of self-destruction. The mention of Michael's name, the presumption of knowing what he would want, broke something open in Rebecca. She heard her own voice, louder than she intended, telling Jolene that she had no right to use Michael as a weapon, that Michael had loved Rebecca exactly as she was, had never demanded she be more social or more ambitious or more anything, that Michael had been the one person who let Rebecca exist without constantly suggesting improvements, and that taking care of Ember was not self-destruction. It was the first thing that had made Rebecca want to stay alive since the accident. The words hung in the cold air between them. Jolene's face went pale, then red. She said that was exactly what she was worried about, that Rebecca's mental state was clearly more fragile than she had realized, that this confirmed Rebecca needed professional help, not a sick animal, that Jolene was going to make some calls, talk to people about what options existed for someone who was clearly not capable of making sound decisions. The threat was barely veiled, the suggestion of intervention or forced psychiatric care underlying every word. Rebecca felt panic rising in her chest, the old helplessness that had defined so much of her life before Michael, the sense that other people always knew better, always had the right to make decisions about her well-being without her consent. But then Ember whinnied again, stronger this time, and Rebecca looked down at the foal who had survived against impossible odds, who had kept breathing when everyone said she should not, who had trusted Rebecca enough to let her provide care even when that care was clumsy and inadequate. And Rebecca realized she was not the same person who had arrived in Redstone Valley 3 months ago, hollow and ready to disappear. She had something to protect now, something that depended on her, and that changed everything. Rebecca told Jolene to leave. Her voice was quiet but steady, and it surprised them both. She said that she appreciated Jolene's concern, but she was not going anywhere. She was not coming to stay with family, and she was not abandoning Ember. If Jolene wanted to call someone, to try to have Rebecca declared unfit or incompetent, she could try. But Rebecca would fight it, because for the first time in 8 months, she had a reason to fight. Jolene stared at her, speechless for a moment. Then she turned and walked out of the garage, her footsteps hard and angry on the gravel. Rebecca heard the car door slam, the engine start, the sound of tires spitting rocks as Jolene drove away too fast. When the sound faded, Rebecca sank down beside Ember, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and fear. She had just burned a bridge with her only remaining family connection. She had just invited exactly the kind of scrutiny she had been trying to avoid. And she had done it for a foal who might still die, who might never be healthy enough to justify the cost Rebecca had already paid. But as Ember shifted closer, pressing her warm weight against Rebecca's leg, Rebecca felt a certainty that went deeper than logic. This was where she was supposed to be. This was what she was supposed to be doing. And if the whole town, including her sister-in-law, thought she was crazy, then maybe crazy was exactly what she needed to be. Danny arrived 20 minutes later, his truck skidding slightly on the gravel as he pulled up fast. He jumped out and hurried to the garage, his face creased with worry. He said his mom had seen a car leaving Rebecca's place looking angry, and she had sent him to check if everything was okay. Rebecca almost laughed at the question because nothing was okay, but also somehow everything was more okay than it had been in months. She told Danny about Jolene's visit, about the accusations and threats, and watched his young face harden with an anger that looked too old for his features. Danny said that people in town had been talking, that there were two camps forming. Some thought Rebecca was doing something brave and good, taking an Ember when no one else would. Others thought she was unstable, that the whole situation was a cry for help that would end badly. Graham Hutchins had been in the latter camp from the start, making comments at the feed store about how it was only a matter of time before the foal died or Rebecca gave up. Danny's jaw tightened as he said it, and Rebecca understood that the boy had been defending her, had been arguing with men twice his age about something he barely understood himself. Rebecca asked Danny why he kept coming back, why he cared about what happened to Ember or to her. Danny looked uncomfortable, scuffing his boot against the dirt floor. He said that his older brother had died 2 years ago, overdose that no one had seen coming even though looking back all the signs had been there. His family had fallen apart afterward, everyone dealing with it in their own way, no one really talking about it. When he had heard about Rebecca finding Ember, about her refusing to give up even when everyone said she should, it had reminded him of something he had forgotten. That sometimes the fight mattered more than the odds. That sometimes you had to try even when trying looked like foolishness to everyone else. Rebecca felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She thanked Danny, her voice rough with emotion. The boy shrugged like it was nothing, but his ears went red the way they did when he was embarrassed. He said he should probably check the four, that Dr. Voss had shown him how to make sure the line was flowing properly. Rebecca nodded and watched him work. This teenage boy who had somehow become her only real ally in a town that could not decide if she was a saint or a disaster. As Danny adjusted the four bag, Ember lifted her head and watched him with clear, curious eyes. It was the first time Rebecca had seen the foal show real interest in anything beyond survival. Ember's ears flicked forward, tracking Danny's movements, and when he reached out to stroke her neck, she leaned into the touch instead of pulling away. Danny grinned, the expression transforming his worried face into something younger and more hopeful. He said she was getting stronger, that you could see it in the way she held herself. Rebecca agreed, feeling a fragile optimism that scared her with its intensity. They stayed like that for a while, the three of them in the dim garage with the wind howling outside, and Rebecca thought about what Jolene had said, about using Ember as a substitute for dealing with grief. Maybe there was truth in it, but not the way Jolene meant. Because grief was not something you dealt with and moved past. It was something you learned to carry, to integrate into who you were becoming. And maybe caring for Ember was part of that integration, a way of proving to herself that she could still nurture life even when death had taken so much from her. When Danny finally left, promising to come back tomorrow after school, Rebecca prepared for another long night of medication schedules and vigilant monitoring. But as she settled into her spot beside Ember, watching the foals breathing steady into something close to peaceful sleep, Rebecca realized she was not dreading the hours ahead. She was not counting down until morning with the desperate need to just get through. She was present in this moment, in this cold garage with this fragile life depending on her, and it was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The morning Ember first stood on her own was the kind of morning that felt like a beginning. Rebecca had been checking on her every hour through the night, administering medications and adjusting blankets, when just before dawn she noticed the foal shifting her weight differently. Ember's front legs were tucked beneath her muscles tensing in a way they had not before. Rebecca held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever instinct was driving this attempt. Ember rocked forward once, twice, then pushed herself up onto trembling legs. She swayed dangerously, her body still weak from weeks of fighting infection and fever, but she was standing. Her head came up, ears forward, and she let out a sound that was part triumph and part confusion, as if she could not quite believe what her body had just accomplished. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. Her hand pressed to her mouth to keep from making a sound that might startle Ember back to the ground. The foal stood for maybe 30 seconds before her legs buckled and she folded back down onto the blankets. But those 30 seconds changed everything. Dr. Voss arrived later that morning for her daily check, and when Rebecca told her about Ember standing, the veterinarian's carefully maintained professional distance cracked into something that looked almost like pride. She examined Ember thoroughly, checking the healing wound, testing the neurological responses that had been so concerning in the early days. When she finished, Dr. Voss sat back and told Rebecca that Ember had turned a corner. She was not out of danger yet, would need weeks more of careful monitoring and gradual strengthening, but the crisis had passed. She was going to survive. The news spread through Redstone Valley with the same speed as the initial gossip, but this time the tone was different. Rebecca noticed it first at the post office, where the clerk actually smiled at her and asked how the foal was doing. Then at the small grocery store, where an older woman Rebecca had never spoken to stopped her in the produce aisle to say she had been praying for them both. Even Patterson at the feed store seemed marginally less hostile, though he still would not quite meet her eyes when he rang up her purchases. But with the good news came complications Rebecca had been trying not to think about. Ember was getting stronger, which meant she needed more space, more exercise, more of everything Rebecca could not provide in a garage barely bigger than a closet. The foal was attempting to stand multiple times a day now, and soon she would need room to walk, to build the muscle strength she had lost during the worst of her illness. Dr. Voss had made it clear that keeping Ember confined much longer would cause new problems, but Rebecca had nowhere to move her. The situation came to a head on a Thursday afternoon when Graham Hutchins showed up at Rebecca's cabin. She had been outside trying to reinforce the fence around her small yard, thinking maybe she could create a temporary paddock, when his truck pulled up. Hutchins got out slowly, his expression unreadable, and Rebecca felt her stomach drop. This was the confrontation she had been dreading, the moment when he would exercise his legal right to reclaim property found on his land. Hutchins stood for a moment, looking at the garage, at Rebecca's shabby cabin, at the general air of barely managed survival that characterized her existence here. When he finally spoke, his voice was neutral but not unkind. He said he had been hearing things around town, about how the foal was recovering, about how Rebecca had managed to do what most people thought was impossible. He wanted to see the animal for himself if Rebecca would allow it. The request caught Rebecca off guard. She had been preparing for accusations or demands, not polite inquiry. She nodded and led him to the garage, her heart pounding. Ember was standing when they entered, wobbling slightly but holding her own weight. At the sound of strangers, she turned her head, ears forward with curiosity rather than fear. Hutchins stopped in the doorway, his weathered face registering surprise. He asked how old Rebecca thought the foal was. Rebecca said Dr. Voss estimated about 4 weeks now, maybe 5. Hutchins nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Ember. He said he had owned the mare who birthed this foal, a feral chestnut he had been trying to gentle for breeding. The mare had gotten loose 3 months back, and he had assumed she was long gone into the high country. He had not even known she was pregnant. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. She asked if he was here to take Ember back. Hutchins was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head. He said that Foal had been born on his property, true enough, but she had also been left to die there. He had made the choice not to go looking when Danny told him about the mare's cries, had decided it was not worth his time or trouble. That choice meant he had forfeited any claim to moral ownership, even if the law might say different. He gestured to Ember, to the 4 stands still set up in the corner, to the careful organization of medical supplies. He said Rebecca had done more for that animal in 3 weeks than he would have done in a lifetime, and he was not going to take that away from her. Rebecca could barely process what she was hearing. Relief flooded through her so intensely she felt lightheaded. But Hutchins was not finished. He said there was still the problem of where Rebecca planned to keep Ember long-term. The foal would need pasture soon, proper shelter for the winter that was coming hard and fast. He knew Rebecca was renting month to month with no land, no resources to speak of. He did not say it meanly, just stating facts they both knew were true. Rebecca nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. She had been lying awake at night trying to solve this exact problem, coming up with nothing but increasingly desperate ideas. Hutchins pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands, a gesture that seemed almost nervous. He said he had 40 acres on the far side of his mining property that he was not using for much of anything. Good grass, a run-in shelter that needed some repairs but was structurally sound, a water source from the creek that ran along the boundary. If Rebecca wanted, she could keep Ember there. No rent, no expectation of payment. Call it restitution for leaving the foal in the first place, or call it whatever made sense to her. The offer hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Rebecca could not immediately find words to respond. She finally managed to ask why he would do that. Hutchins shrugged, looking uncomfortable. He said he had a daughter about Rebecca's age, living in Oregon now with kids of her own. They had not spoken in 3 years, some argument about his drinking that had escalated until the bridge between them burned down completely. He had been trying to figure out how to rebuild that bridge, and his daughter had told him once that maybe he should try being the kind of person who helped instead of the kind who always took the easiest path. He did not know if offering pasture to a woman and her foal would make any difference to his daughter, but it felt like a start. His voice was rough with emotion he was clearly not comfortable expressing. Rebecca felt tears spilling over again, the release of a tension she had been carrying for so long. She told Hutchins yes, they would accept his offer, and thank you did not feel like nearly enough words. Hutchins nodded once, settled his hat back on his head, and said he would have Danny come by tomorrow to help move Ember when Dr. Voss gave the okay. He would make sure the shelter was weather-tight before the next snow. Then he left, his truck disappearing down the gravel road, leaving Rebecca standing in her garage with Ember and a future that suddenly looked possible. When Danny arrived the next afternoon, Rebecca told him about Hutchins' offer. The boy's face split into a grin so wide it looked painful. He said his mom had been right, that sometimes people surprised you when you least expected it. They spent the afternoon making plans for how to transport Ember, what supplies would need to be moved, how to set up the new space so the foal would feel safe during the transition. Dr. Voss stopped by in the evening and gave her approval for the move, as long as they took it slow and kept Ember warm during the short truck ride. The day of the move arrived with clear skies and temperatures just above freezing. Danny brought his family's horse trailer, smaller and older but clean and bedded with fresh straw. Rebecca had been preparing Ember for 2 days, getting her used to walking short distances, building up her strength. When the moment came to load her into the trailer, Rebecca felt a spike of anxiety. What if the stress was too much? What if Ember panicked and hurt herself? But the foal followed Rebecca up the ramp with only minor hesitation, her trust in the woman who had saved her life overriding her fear of the unknown. The drive to Hutchins' property took only 15 minutes, but it felt endless. Rebecca rode in the trailer with Ember, talking to her constantly, one hand resting on the foal's neck to provide reassurance. When they finally pulled up to the pasture Hutchins had described, Rebecca felt something release in her chest. The land was exactly as he had said, 40 acres of rolling grass with a solid fence line and a 3-sided shelter positioned to block the worst of the winter winds. A water tank had been filled, and someone had spread fresh straw inside the shelter. Danny helped Rebecca unload Ember carefully, supporting her weight as the foal navigated the ramp down to new ground. When Ember's hooves touched grass for the first time, she stopped completely, her whole body going still. Then she dropped her nose to the ground and sniffed, blowing hard enough to make the grass stems flutter. She took a tentative step, then another, and suddenly she was moving across the pasture in an awkward, stumbling gait that was somewhere between a walk and a trot. Rebecca and Danny watched from the fence as Ember explored her new world, occasionally stopping to look back as if checking that Rebecca was still there, still keeping watch. The foal's coat gleamed copper in the afternoon sun, and for the first time since Rebecca had found her, Ember looked like she belonged in the world rather than just clinging to the edges of it. Over the following weeks, Ember grew stronger with a speed that amazed everyone who had seen her at her worst. The neurological symptoms that had been so concerning faded almost completely, leaving only an occasional tremor in her left hind leg when she was tired. Her weight increased steadily as Rebecca brought grain twice daily and made sure the water tank stayed filled and ice-free as winter settled in properly. The wound on her leg healed into a scar that would always be there but no longer caused her pain or limitation. Dr. Voss reduced her visits to once a week, then once every 2 weeks, each time marveling at the transformation. Rebecca found herself spending most of her time at the pasture, arriving early in the morning and often staying until after dark. She brought a thermos of coffee and sat on the fence rail, watching Ember graze or nap in the winter sun. Danny joined her most afternoons after school, and sometimes Dr. Voss would stop by on her rounds, the three of them standing together in the cold and talking about things that had nothing to do with sick animals or survival. Rebecca learned that Danny wanted to be a veterinarian himself someday, that he had been saving money from his ranch work toward community college. Dr. Voss shared stories about her own early years in practice, about the cases that had broken her heart and the ones that had reminded her why she did this work. The town's opinion of Rebecca shifted gradually, the way spring ice melts from the edges inward. People who had whispered about her instability began to nod in greeting when they passed on the street. The woman at the grocery store started setting aside bruised produce that was still good, selling it to Rebecca at a discount she suspected was more generous than standard. Patterson at the feed store began offering advice on winter horse care, gruff but genuine. And one morning, Rebecca found an envelope taped to her cabin door with $200 cash inside and a note that said simply, "For Ember's hay, from a friend." She never found out who had left it. Jolene called 3 times before Rebecca finally answered. The conversation was stilted, both of them navigating around the things that had been said during that terrible visit. Jolene did not apologize exactly, but she asked how Ember was doing, and her tone was different, less certain, less judgmental. Rebecca told her about the recovery, about Hutchins' land, about the small community that had formed around helping. Jolene was quiet for a long moment, then said she was glad Rebecca had found something worth fighting for. It was not reconciliation, but it was not warfare either, and Rebecca decided that was enough for now. Winter deepened, and Rebecca took a part-time job at the veterinary clinic, assisting Dr. Voss with basic tasks and learning more about equine care. The work did not pay much, but it was enough to cover her rent and Ember's feed with a little left over. Dr. Voss said if Rebecca wanted, she could work toward getting her veterinary technician license reinstated, that she clearly had not lost her skills even if grief had made her doubt them. Rebecca said she would think about it and found herself actually meaning it rather than just deflecting. On a bright January morning, when the snow lay thick over the pasture and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe, Rebecca arrived to find Ember waiting at the fence. The foal had grown into a yearling now, gangly and awkward in the way of young horses, but healthy. Her coat had thickened for winter, and her eyes were bright and curious. When she saw Rebecca, she whinnied and trotted over, pressing her nose into Rebecca's hands to search for the carrot she knew would be there. Rebecca fed her the treat and stroked her face, marveling at how far they had both come from that desperate morning in the ravine. Danny showed up an hour later with a bridle he had borrowed from his mother. He said if Rebecca was interested, they could start working with Ember on basic ground training, teaching her to lead properly and accept being handled. Nothing serious yet, just baby steps toward the day when the yearling might be ready for more. Rebecca agreed, and they spent the morning in the pasture, showing Ember how to respond to gentle pressure on the lead rope, how to pick up her feet on command, how to stand still for grooming. Ember was a fast learner, eager to please and remarkably patient for such a young horse. Danny said it was because she had bonded so strongly with Rebecca during those early weeks, that trust built in crisis created a foundation that was hard to break. As they worked, Graham Hutchins drove up in his truck and watched from a distance. When they took a break, he walked over and leaned against the fence. He said he had talked to his daughter on the phone the previous night, the first real conversation they had managed in years. He had told her about Rebecca and Ember, about offering the land, about watching someone refuse to give up when giving up would have been easier. His daughter had cried, he said, his voice rough, told him she was proud of him for trying to be different, asked if maybe she and the grandkids could come visit in the spring. Hutchins did not look at Rebecca when he said it, kept his eyes on the distant mountains, but his meaning was clear. Sometimes saving one thing created ripples that reached farther than you could see. The months that followed established a rhythm that felt like healing. Rebecca worked at the clinic 4 days a week, spent her free time with Ember, and slowly began to reconnect with the world she had been hiding from. She started answering calls from old friends, brief conversations that did not demand more than she could give. She attended a community potluck at Danny's mother's insistence and found herself actually talking to people, sharing Ember's story, listening to theirs. She was not the same person she had been before Michael died, and she never would be. But she was becoming someone new, someone who carried grief without being crushed by it, someone who understood that love and loss were not opposites but partners in the dance of being alive. Spring arrived late in Montana, the snow finally retreating in March to reveal mud and the first brave shoots of grass. Ember shed her winter coat in patches, emerging sleek and copper bright underneath. She had grown tall, her legs long and her body filling out with good muscle. Dr. Voss examined her one afternoon and declared her sound, healthy, and showing no lasting effects from the trauma of her early weeks. She would always have the scar on her leg and the occasional tremor when tired, but neither would stop her from living a full life. Whether that life included riding or work or just being a pasture pet was up to Rebecca to decide when the time came. But that decision felt distant and unimportant compared to the simple fact of Ember's existence, of her survival against odds that should have been impossible. Rebecca thought often about that morning in the ravine, about the choice she had made to climb down instead of walk away. She had told herself at the time that she was saving the foal, but the truth was more complicated. They had saved each other. Ember had given Rebecca a reason to keep breathing when breathing felt pointless, had given her something to fight for when she had forgotten how to fight, had shown her that broken things could heal if someone cared enough to hold them together through the worst of it. On a warm afternoon in early April, Rebecca sat on the fence rail watching Ember graze, the sun warm on her face and the sound of meadowlarks filling the air. Danny had graduated high school the week before and been accepted to the veterinary technology program at the community college with a scholarship that covered most of his tuition. Dr. Voss had offered Rebecca a full-time position at the clinic with benefits and a path toward reinstating her license. Hutchins had told her she could keep using the pasture as long as she needed it, that he liked having life on that empty land. Jolene had sent a card with a photo of Michael that Rebecca had never seen, the two of them laughing at some long-forgotten joke, and a note that said simply, "He would be so proud of who you're becoming." Rebecca pulled out her phone and took a photo of Ember standing in the spring grass, head up and ears forward, looking every inch the healthy young horse she had become. She posted it to the small-town Facebook group that had followed their story from the beginning, typing a caption that felt inadequate but true. "1 year ago today, I found a dying foal in a ravine and made a choice that changed my life. Thank you to everyone in Redstone Valley who helped us both survive. Ember is thriving and so am I." She hit post before she could second-guess herself. The responses came within minutes. Dozens of comments from people she knew and people she had never met, all celebrating Ember's recovery and Rebecca's determination. Someone suggested an open house at the pasture so the community could meet Ember properly. Danny's mother offered to organize a potluck. Dr. Voss commented that she had never been prouder of a patient or their caretaker. And buried in the comments, Graham Hutchins wrote simply, "Some things are worth fighting for. You proved that." Rebecca closed her phone and looked at Ember, this creature who had been discarded and left to die, who had survived through sheer stubborn will and the intervention of someone who understood what it meant to be abandoned. The yearling lifted her head and looked directly at Rebecca, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Then she trotted over to the fence, pressed her nose into Rebecca's hands and blew softly, a sound of contentment and trust. Rebecca wrapped her arms around Ember's neck and let herself cry, not from grief this time, but from gratitude, for second chances, for the kindness of strangers who became friends, for the reminder that sometimes the things we save end up saving us right back. The wind carried the scent of sage and new grass across the pasture, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out as it rode the thermals higher into the brilliant blue sky. Rebecca stayed there for a long time, holding on to Ember and feeling the solid warmth of her, proof that impossible things sometimes happened anyway. That love, when given freely and without expectation, could transform the world in ways too profound to measure. That a woman and a foal, both broken and both fighting, could find their way back to wholeness together. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, Rebecca finally released her hold on Ember and stepped back. The yearling stood quietly, watching her with those intelligent eyes that had seen too much suffering and somehow still chose trust. Rebecca smiled, the expression feeling natural on her face in a way it had not for over a year. She told Ember they should head back, that there would be more days like this, more moments of peace and sunlight and simple joy. Ember whinnied softly in response and followed Rebecca across the pasture toward the shelter, their shadows stretching long in the fading light. Summer arrived in Redstone Valley with a gentleness that felt like forgiveness. The harsh edges of winter softened into long days where the sun hung in the sky until nearly 10 at night, and the pasture where Ember grazed transformed into a sea of wildflowers that swayed in waves with every breath of wind. Rebecca had fallen into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like actual living, the kind where she made plans beyond the immediate moment and could imagine a future that extended past next week's feed bill. The veterinary clinic had become more than just a job. Dr. Voss had taken Rebecca under her wing in a way that went beyond professional mentorship, teaching her not just technical skills, but the art of reading animals, of understanding the unspoken communication that passed between creature and caretaker. Rebecca found herself handling more complex cases, assisting with surgeries, even taking emergency calls when Dr. Voss was unavailable. Her hands had stopped shaking months ago, and the confidence she thought she had lost forever was slowly rebuilding itself from the foundation up. Ember had grown into herself over the spring and early summer, her body filling out with the kind of muscle that came from having space to run and play. She had discovered her own speed one morning in May, racing from one end of the 40 acres to the other for the sheer joy of movement, her mane and tail streaming behind her like copper banners. Rebecca had stood at the fence watching with her heart in her throat, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. This was the horse Ember was always meant to become, wild and free and gloriously alive. Danny had started his courses at the community college and spent his weekends at the pasture, working with Ember on the ground training that would eventually prepare her for riding. He had a gift for it, a patience and intuition that reminded Rebecca why he had chosen this path. Under his guidance, Ember learned to lunge at various gaits, to stand quietly for grooming even when flies pestered her, to load into a trailer without the panic that had marked her first journey. The yearling seemed to understand that the work had purpose, that these humans who cared for her were preparing her for something beyond just existing. On a Thursday evening in late June, Rebecca was closing up the clinic when her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. The voice on the other end was female, older, with the careful pronunciation of someone for whom English was a second language. She introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, said she was calling about the story of Ember that had been shared in a regional horse rescue newsletter. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten with sudden anxiety. She had not known their story had traveled beyond Redstone Valley's Facebook group. Mrs. Chun explained that she ran a therapeutic riding program 3 hours north, working with children who had experienced trauma, abuse, or severe illness. She had been following Ember's recovery through the updates Rebecca posted, and she believed the yearling might have a calling beyond being someone's backyard pet. Horses who had survived their own trauma often had an uncanny ability to connect with humans going through similar struggles. There was something about shared suffering that created understanding beyond words. Mrs. Chun wondered if Rebecca would consider allowing Ember to be evaluated for the program once she was old enough and trained enough to safely carry riders. Rebecca stood in the empty clinic parking lot, watching the sun sink toward the mountains, and felt a complicated tangle of emotions she could not immediately sort. Pride that someone saw value in Ember beyond her troubled start. Fear at the thought of sharing her with strangers, of trusting others to understand what made her special. And underneath it all, a recognition that keeping Ember entirely to herself might be protecting Rebecca's own heart more than serving the horse's best interest. She told Mrs. Chun she would need to think about it, to discuss it with the people who had been part of Ember's journey. Mrs. Chun gave her a number and an email address, said there was no pressure, but she hoped Rebecca would visit the facility before making any decisions. That night, Rebecca drove out to the pasture even though it was past her usual visiting hours. The summer twilight stretched long and blue, and Ember was standing near the shelter, ears forward when she heard Rebecca's truck. The yearling walked over to greet her, and Rebecca leaned against the fence breathing in the smell of horse and grass, and the particular scent of Montana summer that was like nowhere else on earth. She told Ember about the phone call, about the possibility of purpose beyond what Rebecca had imagined, and waited as if the horse might offer guidance. Ember stood quietly, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of day, and Rebecca thought about all the mornings in that cramped garage when survival had been the only goal. She had never considered what came after survival, what Ember's life might look like once she was healed and whole. Rebecca had assumed, without ever articulating it to herself, that Ember would simply stay here forever, a beautiful reminder of the worst and best moments of Rebecca's life. But maybe that was not fair to the horse. Maybe Ember deserved the chance to do more than stand as a monument to Rebecca's grief and healing. The next morning, Rebecca called Danny and Dr. Voss, explained the situation, and asked their opinions. Danny was immediately enthusiastic, talking fast about how amazing it would be if Ember could help kids the way she had helped them. Dr. Voss was more measured, asking practical questions about the program's safety protocols, the training requirements, whether Rebecca would maintain ownership or transfer it entirely. But underneath the veterinarian's caution, Rebecca heard approval. Dr. Voss said that horses were not meant to be locked away and protected from the world, that the best gift you could give an animal was the chance to fulfill whatever purpose they were built for. Rebecca spent the weekend researching therapeutic riding programs, reading studies about the effectiveness of equine-assisted therapy for trauma survivors, watching videos of children with autism or PTSD finding peace in the presence of horses. What she found surprised her. The research was compelling, showing measurable improvements in emotional regulation, trust building, and even physical coordination. But what moved her more were the testimonials from parents describing children who had not spoken in months finding their voices while brushing a patient mare, or teenagers who had survived abuse learning that not all large creatures used their strength to harm. On Monday, Rebecca called Mrs. Chun and said she wanted to visit the facility. They arranged a time for the following Saturday, and Rebecca asked if Danny could come with her. Mrs. Chun said, of course, that she always appreciated meeting everyone involved in a potential therapy horse's life. The drive north took them through landscape that shifted from the familiar valleys around Redstone to higher country, where pine forests crowded the roadside, and the air smelled different, sharper and greener. Danny talked the whole way, his excitement barely contained, while Rebecca gripped the steering wheel and tried to quiet the voice in her head that said she was betraying Ember by even considering this. The facility was nothing like what Rebecca had imagined. She had pictured something institutional, maybe run down, probably depressing. Instead, they drove through gates that opened onto beautifully maintained grounds with a covered arena, multiple pastures with horses of all sizes and colors, and a main building that looked more like a welcoming farmhouse than a medical facility. Mrs. Chun met them in the parking area, a small woman in her 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime working with animals. She gave them a tour, introducing them to the current therapy horses and explaining each one's story. There was a draft cross named Bear who had been rescued from a slaughter auction and now worked with teenage boys in the juvenile justice system. A Mustang mare called Sage who specialized in helping children with selective mutism find their voices. An elderly gelding named Prophet who seemed to have endless patience for the chaotic energy of kids with ADHD. Each horse had been given a second chance, and each had found a way to give that chance back to the humans who needed it. They watched a session in progress, a girl of maybe 10 working with a paint horse under the supervision of 2 therapists. The girl was brushing the horse with intense concentration, and Mrs. Chun explained quietly that she had been in foster care for 3 years after being removed from an abusive home. She had not trusted any adult or animal when she first came to the program 6 months ago. Now she was learning that gentleness could be reciprocated, that care did not have to come with conditions or threats. Rebecca watched the girl's face soften as the horse lowered his head to her level, and felt something crack open in her chest. After the tour, they sat in Mrs. Chen's office, a cluttered space filled with photos of horses and children, certificates on the walls, and the comfortable chaos of a place where real work happened. Mrs. Chun poured them tea and explained how the program worked. Horses had to be at least 4 years old and fully trained before they could carry riders in therapy sessions. They needed bomb-proof temperaments, the ability to stay calm when children cried or screamed or moved unpredictably. Not every horse was suited for the work, even horses with trauma histories of their own. But there was something about the ones who had suffered and survived that often made them uniquely qualified. Rebecca asked what would happen to Ember if she came here. Mrs. Chun explained that she would continue her training with their professional staff, learning to tolerate the equipment and situations specific to therapeutic work. She would be evaluated continuously to ensure the work was not causing her distress. If at any point she showed signs of unhappiness or stress, they would find her a different placement. Rebecca would be welcome to visit as often as she wanted, and she would maintain ownership, able to withdraw Ember from the program at any time. The horse would live here but would always belong to Rebecca, a partnership rather than a surrender. Danny leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and asked the question Rebecca had been afraid to voice. What if Ember was not suited for this work? What if her own trauma made her too unpredictable or anxious? Mrs. Chun smiled, and her expression was gentle. Then Rebecca would have learned something valuable about her horse, and Ember would go on to live whatever life made her happiest. There was no failure in discovering that a horse's path led elsewhere. The only failure was in never giving them the chance to find out who they could become. The drive back to Redstone Valley was quieter than the drive up. Rebecca felt like she was carrying something heavy and fragile, a decision that could go either way and would be right or wrong only in retrospect. Danny finally broke the silence by saying that he thought Ember would be amazing at that work, that she had already proven she could connect with humans who were struggling. Look at what she had done for Rebecca, for Danny himself, even for Graham Hutchins in a way. Ember had this quality of making people feel seen, of standing witness to pain without trying to fix it or turn away from it. Danny's voice was thoughtful, older than his 19 years. He said maybe that was what healing looked like sometimes, just being present with someone while they found their own way through. Rebecca did not answer right away, but she knew Danny was right. She had been thinking of Ember as something she had saved, something she owned by virtue of the care she had poured into those desperate early weeks. But Ember was not a possession or a monument. She was her own creature, with her own capacity for purpose and connection. And maybe the greatest act of love Rebecca could offer was to let Ember become whatever she was meant to be, even if that meant sharing her with a world that would not always be gentle. That evening, Rebecca sat with Ember in the pasture until the stars came out. The yearling grazed nearby, occasionally lifting her head to check that Rebecca was still there, still keeping watch. Rebecca talked through her thoughts out loud, a habit she had developed during those long nights in the garage. She told Ember about the facility, about the children who needed what only horses could give them, about the chance to turn suffering into service. She said she was scared of letting go even a little bit, scared that Ember might forget who had sat with her through the worst nights, who had refused to give up when everyone said to. But she was also scared of holding on so tightly that she kept Ember from becoming who she was meant to be. Ember moved closer, pressing her shoulder against the fence where Rebecca sat. The gesture was familiar now, the yearling's way of offering comfort or asking for it, the lines between giving and receiving blurred beyond distinction. Rebecca stroked her neck, feeling the solid warmth of muscle and life, and made her decision. She would allow the evaluation. She would give Ember the chance to try this work, to see if her own healing could become a gift to others. But she would do it on a timeline that felt right, not rushing, making sure Ember was truly ready not just physically but emotionally. And she would trust that if this path was wrong, Ember would show her, and they would find another way together. The summer passed in a blur of preparation. Rebecca threw herself into Ember's continued training with new focus, working with Danny and occasionally Dr. Voss to expose the yearling to as many new experiences as possible. They practiced in the covered arena at a neighboring ranch, getting Ember comfortable with enclosed spaces and echoing sounds. They introduced her to children, starting with Danny's young cousins who were coached on how to move slowly and speak softly. Ember handled it all with remarkable composure, her early trauma seeming to have taught her to assess situations carefully rather than react with panic. By late August, as Ember approached her second birthday, Rebecca felt confident enough to contact Mrs. Chun and schedule a preliminary evaluation. The older woman drove down to Redstone Valley herself, wanting to see Ember in her home environment before making any recommendations. She spent an afternoon at the pasture, watching Rebecca and Danny work with the yearling, observing how Ember responded to unexpected stimuli like a tarp flapping in the wind or a dog barking nearby. Mrs. Chun asked to handle Ember herself, and Rebecca stepped back with her heart in her throat, watching a stranger interact with the horse she had poured her entire self into saving. Ember accepted Mrs. Chen's touch with her characteristic caution, sniffing the woman's hands thoroughly before allowing herself to be haltered and led around the pasture. Mrs. Chun worked her through a series of simple exercises, asking her to stop and start, to turn in tight circles, to stand still while Mrs. Chun moved around her making sudden gestures. Through it all, Ember remained calm and focused, her ears flicking to track Mrs. Chen's position but her feet staying planted. When the evaluation ended, Mrs. Chun turned to Rebecca with a smile that lit her weathered face. She said Ember had something special, a quality that could not be trained, only nurtured. She believed with continued work, the yearling would make an exceptional therapy horse. The next 2 years passed in a way that felt both fast and achingly slow. Ember went to Mrs. Chen's facility the autumn after her second birthday, and Rebecca drove up to visit every other weekend, sometimes staying overnight in the guest room Mrs. Chun kept for volunteers and visiting families. She watched Ember progress through her training, learning to carry a rider, to tolerate the chaotic energy of children, to stand perfectly still when a sobbing teenager buried their face in her neck. The yearling grew into a beautiful mare, her body maturing into elegant lines and her temperament deepening into something that seemed almost wise. Rebecca continued working at the clinic, and Dr. Voss made her a full partner in the practice the spring after Ember left. The title came with responsibilities and stress Rebecca had not anticipated, but also with a sense of belonging she had never expected to find. Redstone Valley had stopped being a place she was hiding and had become simply home, with all the complicated roots and connections that word implied. She bought the cabin she had been renting, a decision that felt both terrifying and right. She started dating a forestry service ranger named Thomas who was quiet and steady and did not push her to be anything other than what she was. Danny finished his veterinary technology degree and came to work at the clinic, his youthful enthusiasm balanced now by genuine skill. He visited Ember nearly as often as Rebecca did, his bond with the mare remaining strong despite the distance. Graham Hutchins stopped by the clinic one day to have his aging cattle dog examined, and he told Rebecca that his daughter and grandchildren had visited 3 times in the past year, that they were talking about maybe moving back to Montana. He said it with his typical gruffness, but his eyes were softer than they used to be, and Rebecca understood that some kinds of healing happen slowly, in increments too small to measure day by day but undeniable over time. Jolene sent Christmas cards now, with photos of her family and brief updates that felt more genuine than the forced cheerfulness of earlier years. She came to visit once, a tense weekend that had moments of real connection mixed with the awkwardness of people who had hurt each other trying to find their way back to something resembling family. They went together to visit Ember, and Jolene stood at the fence watching the mare work with a child who had survived cancer, her face unreadable. Later, she told Rebecca that she understood now what Rebecca had been trying to tell her that awful day in the garage, that sometimes the things we save are really saving us, and it does not matter which is which. On a bright October morning, 3 years after Rebecca had found a dying foal in a ravine, she drove north to the therapeutic riding facility for a special occasion. Ember was being formally certified as a full therapy horse, having completed all her training and logged the required hours working under supervision. Mrs. Chun had invited Rebecca to be part of a small ceremony, and Rebecca had asked Danny and Dr. Voss to come with her. Thomas drove, his steady presence beside her a comfort as her nerves ramped up. When they arrived, the facility was decorated with simple banners and a small gathering of staff, volunteers, and several families whose children worked with Ember regularly. Mrs. Chun gave a short speech about the importance of second chances, about how the best therapy horses were often the ones who understood suffering from the inside. She called Rebecca forward and presented her with a framed photo of Ember, beautiful and calm, with a little girl leaning against her shoulder in a moment of perfect trust. Mrs. Chun said that Rebecca had saved this horse's life, but Ember had gone on to touch dozens of others, creating ripples of healing that extended far beyond what any of them could fully measure. Rebecca tried to give a speech in return, to express what Ember had meant to her, but her throat closed up with emotion and she could only manage a few words about second chances going both ways, about how the act of saving something could save the saver. She looked at Ember, standing patiently in the arena with children gathered around her, and felt a profound gratitude for that desperate morning when she had chosen to climb down into the ravine instead of walking away. Every good thing in her life now had flowed from that single decision, that moment of choosing connection over isolation, hope over despair. After the ceremony, Rebecca spent time with Ember alone in one of the smaller pastures. The mare came to her immediately, pressing her face into Rebecca's hands in the familiar gesture that had once been a dying foal seeking comfort and had become a healthy horse offering it. Rebecca wrapped her arms around Ember's neck and breathed in the smell of her horse and hay and something indefinably warm. She whispered thank you, though she was not sure if she was thanking Ember for surviving, for becoming this magnificent creature, or for showing Rebecca that life after loss was possible. The drive back to Redstone Valley took them through landscape painted in autumn colors, aspens turning gold against the deep green of pines, the sky that particular shade of blue that only existed in Montana. Danny dozed in the back seat while Dr. Voss rode up front, and she and Rebecca talked about the cases waiting for them at the clinic, about the new equipment they needed to budget for, about the rhythms of a life built around caring for creatures who could not speak their pain but trusted humans to understand it anyway. Thomas glanced over at Rebecca, catching her eye, and smiled. She smiled back, feeling the weight of the past few years settle into something that was no longer burden but foundation. She thought about that night in the garage when she had told Ember they would survive together or not at all. They had both survived, had both found ways to transform their suffering into something that served the world. Ember through the healing she offered traumatized children, Rebecca through the work she did at the clinic and the life she had slowly, painfully rebuilt from the ruins of her grief. As the truck crested the final hill before Redstone Valley came into view, Rebecca pulled out her phone and opened the photo Mrs. Chun had sent her that morning. Ember standing in a beam of sunlight with a little boy on her back. His face split wide with a smile that his mother said was the first genuine joy she had seen in him since his father had died. Rebecca stared at the image for a long moment, then saved it to her favorites, adding it to the collection of photos that documented Ember's transformation from dying foal to healer. The sun was setting as they pulled into town, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text from Graham Hutchins asking if she could look at one of his horses tomorrow, concerned about a limp that had developed overnight. She texted back that she would stop by first thing in the morning. Another text came in from a number she did not recognize, a family who had heard about Ember and wanted to know if Rebecca might be interested in evaluating another rescue horse for the therapy program. She made a note to call them back, to hear their story, to see if she could help create another second chance. When Thomas pulled up to her cabin, Rebecca sat for a moment before getting out, looking at the small house that was truly hers now, at the mountains beyond that she had come to know in all their seasons and moods. She thought about Michael, about the life they had planned that would never happen, and felt the familiar ache of his absence. But the ache was different now, softer and more integrated into who she was becoming. She could carry him with her without being crushed by the weight of loss. could honor his memory by living fully rather than by remaining frozen in grief. Danny stirred in the back seat and mumbled something about seeing her at the clinic tomorrow. Dr. Voss touched Rebecca's shoulder briefly, a gesture of affection from a woman who was not given to overt displays, and said she was proud of her. Thomas walked her to the door and kissed her goodnight, a sweetness and promise in the gesture that Rebecca was learning to accept without waiting for disaster to strike. She watched his truck disappear down the road, then went inside to the small house that smelled like coffee and the lavender sachets she kept in her drawers, simple domestic comforts that had once felt impossible. Before bed, Rebecca pulled up the photos of Ember on her phone, scrolling through the timeline of their journey together. The early images from the garage, the mare barely visible under piles of blankets, eyes glazed with fever. The day she first stood on her own, legs trembling but holding. The move to the pasture, tentative steps on grass. The progression through training, growing stronger and more confident. And finally, the recent images from the therapy facility, Ember serene and powerful, a source of healing for so many. Rebecca set the phone aside and turned off the light, settling into bed with a contentness she had not known was possible 3 years ago. She thought about all the people who had told her to give up on Ember, who had said she was wasting resources on a lost cause. She thought about how close she had come to believing them, to making the practical, sensible choice to end the foal's suffering. And she thought about what would have been lost if she had listened. Not just Ember's life, but all the lives Ember had gone on to touch, including Rebecca's own. Sometimes the most important decisions were the ones that made no logical sense, that defied practical wisdom and demanded faith in possibilities that could not be proven in advance. Sometimes you had to choose hope when hope looked like foolishness, had to fight for something when everyone said to let it go. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that choice rippled outward in ways you could never have imagined, creating healing and connection that transcended the original act. Rebecca closed her eyes and let sleep take her, the last thought drifting through her mind, a simple truth that had taken years and a dying foal to teach her. That love given freely, without guarantee of return, without certainty of outcome, was never wasted. That every act of caring for something broken, whether animal or human or self, sent out waves that touched shores you would never see. That survival was only the beginning, and what came after, the living and growing and becoming, was where the real miracle lived. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.